I had a bit of a crisis in the kitchen last weekend.
Oh no. What
I
has?
tried to make this beautiful, towering sponge cake. I saw it on social media, followed the recipe mostly, and threw it in the oven. It smelled amazing. But when I pulled it out, it looked like a crater on the moon. It just totally collapsed in the middle.
The classic sinking cake. That is a truly heartbreaking moment.
It was tragic. And my first instinct was, well, I guess the baking gods were just angry today. Or maybe I just have terrible luck.
Right, blaming the universe.
Exactly. But then I started reading through the research we have for today's deep dive, specifically the core pillars of baking source material, and I realized luck had absolutely nothing to do with it. I was just failing a chemistry experiment.
That is the perfect way to frame it. People often treat baking like it's an art form, like painting, where you can sort of mix colors on the fly and just see what happens.
Yeah, a pinch of this, a dash of that.
Right. But it's not. It's a laboratory. You are dealing with thermodynamics, biological organisms, chemical reactions. If you don't respect the science will ruin your dessert.
So that is our mission today. For everyone listening, we want to help you move away from that blindly follow the recipe mindset. We're going to dive into the actual mechanics.
The why behind the what.
Exactly. I want to know why my cake sank, why cookies turn out hard when you want them chewy, and why professional bakers are so obsessed with things like scales.
And we are going to do that by breaking down these core pillars. We'll look at the chemistry of the ingredients, the physics of your essential techniques.
Which the source says is way more important than people think.
Oh, it's vital. And we'll also cover troubleshooting common disasters and the professional safety protocols that keep the whole kitchen running smoothly.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start with the stuff we put in the bowl. The chemistry. The documents really emphasize that understanding your ingredients is half the battle. And the biggest player here seems to be leavening. This is the stuff that makes things rise.
Right, but it's not magic dust. It's all about gas production. You are trying to create air pockets. And generally you have two ways to do that, which are chemical or biological.
Chemical being the baking powder and baking soda, right?
Exactly. Those are straightforward chemical reactions.
Yeah.
You add moisture and heat, they react, they release carbon dioxide, and boom, your cake rises.
Fast and reliable.
Very. But the biological side, that's where things get wild. That's yeast.
I always find yeast so intimidating. It feels, I don't know, temperamental.
Well, that's because it's alive. You really have to change your mindset. When you're baking bread, you aren't just cooking. You are essentially zookeeping.
Zookeeping.
You are managing a colony of living fungus.
That sounds significantly less appetizing when you put it that way.
It's delicious fungus. But think about what it does. It eats the sugars in your dough, and it boops out carbon dioxide and alcohol.
And that gas gets trapped in the dough.
Yeah, right. Which creates the rise. But because it's a living thing, it has a life cycle. It needs to be woken up.
Oh, this is the warm water step in literally every bread recipe.
Yes, but here is where beginners always fail. They think, oh, yeast likes warmth. Let me use really hot water to get it going fast.
I have definitely done that.
And you probably killed them all.
All right.
There is a hard biological limit here. The source is very clear on this danger zone. If the water is above 50 degrees Celsius,
Which is about 122 Fahrenheit for our listeners.
right, if it's above that, the yeast dies instantly. It's a mass extinction event in your mixing bowl.
So my bread was a wreck because I boiled the workforce.
Pretty much. Dead yeast doesn't burp, no gas, no rise. You have to eat like baby's bathwater. Warm, not hot.
Okay, so we've got gas expanding in the dough. But what holds that gas in? Because if I just blew bubbles into a bowl of water, they'd pop. We need a structure.
And that brings us to the big G word, gluten.
Gluten. The source material spends a lot of time on this.
It's fascinating because it's so misunderstood. People think of it as just an ingredient, but it's actually a network. It's a protein structure that forms when water mixes with flour and you apply energy.
Energy meaning agitation, like kneading.
Exactly. Imagine the proteins in flour are like little tangled balls of string. When you add water and start kneading, you're untangling those strings and linking them together into a long, strong chain, a web.
And that web is elastic, right? So it stretches to hold those gas bubbles we just talked about.
Precisely. So for a loaf of bread, you want a really strong web. You want it to be chewy and hold its shape.
Which is why bread recipes have you kneading the dough for 10 minutes.
You are physically forcing those proteins to align and lock together. And this is the huge paradox of baking, that is exactly what you do not want for a cake.
Because nobody wants a chewy, rubbery cake.
Right. If you took a cake batter and kneaded it like bread, you would develop too much gluten. You'd end up with a tire.
This makes so much sense. It explains why recipes always say, mix until just combine for cakes and muffins. I always thought they were just trying to save me time.
No, they're trying to stop you from accidentally making bread. It's a sliding scale. You want maximum gluten for bread, medium for pastry, and absolute minimum for tender cakes.
You have to control your agitation based on the texture you want.
Exactly.
Okay, but how do we stop the gluten? I mean, we have to mix the ingredients at some point, right? We can't just stare at them.
That is where the other ingredients come in, specifically fats. Butter, margarine, oil.
Right, I thought butter was just there for flavor and moisture.
It does that too, but functionally it's a gluten blocker. Think about the word shortbread. Why is it called short?
I honestly have no idea, because it doesn't rise very tall.
No, it's because the gluten strands are physically short. When you rub fat into flour, you're coating those little protein strings in grease.
Like waterproofing them.
Exactly. If the protein is coated in fat, it can't absorb water. And if it can't absorb water, it can't link up with other proteins to form those long gluten chains.
Whoa. So the fat is physically getting in the way of the structure. It shortens the strands.
It's a barrier. That's why shortbread just crumbles in your mouth. There is almost no gluten network holding it together because the fat prevented it from forming. It creates what bakers call a tender crumb.
That is wild. It's molecular interference. What about eggs? The core pillars call them the multitaskers of the kitchen.
Eggs are the duct tape of the baking world. They do everything. The yolk has fat, so it helps with that tenderness and flavor, but the whites are mostly water and protein.
So they help hydrate the flour?
Right, but when they get hot in the oven, those egg proteins coagulate. They solidify.
Meaning they provide structure, too.
Huge structure. If you are making a gluten-free cake, the eggs are doing a lot of the heavy lifting to keep that thing standing up. They bind, they moisten, they structure, and they even trap air.
It really highlights how interconnected this whole ecosystem is. You can't just swap ingredients out and expect the same result.
No. If you take out the sugar, you aren't just making it less sweet, you're removing moisture and browning. If you take out the eggs, you lose the glue. It's a very delicate chemical balancing act.
Okay, let's shift gears to the physics, the actual techniques, because the documents make a really bold claim here. They say how you mix is just as important as what you mix.
It's absolutely true. You could have the most expensive, perfect ingredients in the world, but if you mess up the physics of the mixing, the bake will fail.
The first technique that stood out to me was the creaming method. This is usually step one in a cookie or cake recipe, right?
Yeah.
Cream room temperature, butter, and sugar.
Yes.
I admit I usually just smash them together with a spoon until they look mixed, and then I move on.
And that is a critical error. You are missing the entire point of the step. You aren't just combining ingredients, you are harvesting air.
Harvesting air.
Think about it at a microscopic level. Sugar crystals are jagged. They're like little rocks. When you beat them against solid butter, they act like little shovels.
Digging into the fat.
They dig tiny holes into the butter. The longer you beat it, the more holes you dig, and those holes fill with air. That's why the mixture turns pale and fluffy after a few minutes.
So I'm physically trapping air bubbles inside the fat structure.
Exactly. And here's the so what of the whole thing. When that batter hits the hot oven, the air inside those tiny bubbles expands. That is what gives your cake life.
That's the fluffiness.
Yes. If you just melt the butter or if you don't beat it long enough, you have no bubbles. No bubbles means no expansion. You get a dense, sad puck.
So if I microwave the butter because I forgot to leave it out on the counter.
You've destroyed the mechanism. You can't dig holes in liquid. The sugar crystals just dissolve and you lose all that aeration.
Wow. That explains so many of my baking failures. The state of matter literally dictates the physics of the bake.
100%. And the same logic applies to sifting.
Oh, sifting. The step I always skip. I just figure I can mash any flour lumps out later with a whisk.
It's not just about removing lumps. It's about density. If you scoop a cup of flour straight from the bag, it's packed tight. It's heavy.
Right.
Sifting separates the particles and aerates the flour. It makes it physically lighter.
So a cup of unsifted flour actually contains more actual flour than a cup of sifted flour.
Significantly more, sometimes 20 or 30% more.
That's a massive difference.
So if you skip sifting, you are essentially adding way too much flour to your recipe. You are drying out your cake before you've even turned the oven on.
That's a total game changer. Now, what about when we combine things? The notes draw a very strict line between folding and mixing. Is the agitation spectrum really that important?
It's the difference between inflating a balloon and popping it.
Go on.
Folding is a gentle motion.
Yeah.
Usually you do this when you have something delicate like whipped egg whites. and you want to mix them into a heavy batter.
Because you've spent all this time whipping air into the whites to create bubbles.
Exactly. If you stick a whisk in there and beat it vigorously,
Pop, pop.
you smash all the bubbles you just worked so hard to create. Folding is lifting the heavy batter over the whites very gently to preserve that trapped air.
Whereas mixing or beating is vigorous.
Right. That's for developing gluten or combining sturdy things. If you beat a souffle batter, it simply won't rise. It's basic physics.
It feels like the main theme of baking physics is just respect the bubbles.
Respect the bubbles. They're the only thing fighting gravity.
Speaking of bubbles, let's jump back to yeast for a second because there's a terminology distinction in the source that I think confuses a lot of beginners. Fermentation versus proofing.
Oh, yes. People use those interchangeably, but they are distinct phases of the yeast life cycle.
Break that down for us.
Fermentation is the bulk rest. This is right after you've mixed and kneaded the dough. You leave it in a big bowl, usually for an hour or two. The yeast is eating sugar, releasing gas, and developing complex flavors.
And then proofing.
Proofing is the specific final rise. This happens after you've punched the dough down and shaped it into your actual loaf or rolls. It's a final rest right before it hits the heat.
So fermentation builds the flavor and initial structure, and proofing sets the final shape.
Precisely. If you overproof, the structure gets too weak and it collapses in the oven.
Which brings us perfectly to our next section, troubleshooting, fixing the mistakes. Let's go back to the disaster I started the show with, the sinking cake mystery.
The heartbreak.
I put it in, it rises beautifully, I look through the oven glass, and it's glorious. Then, usually right when I take it out, the center just caves in. Why?
There are two main culprits here, and they both involve a battle between pressure and structure.
Okay, what's the first one?
Inside your cake, gas is expanding, which pushes the batter up. At the same time, the eggs and flour are setting from the heat, creating a rigid structure to hold that new shape.
It's a race.
Exactly. If the gas escapes before the structure is fully set, the cake collapses. And the most common reason that happens is impatience, opening the oven door too early.
Curiosity killed the cake.
It really does.
Yeah.
When you open that door, you let out a massive amount of heat. The temperature in the oven plummets. The air bubbles inside the cake cool down and contract instantly.
And if the structure hasn't hardened yet to hold them up?
The whole thing falls inward. You essentially punctured the balloon by dropping the temperature.
Okay, but what if I was good? What if I kept the door closed the whole time and it still sank?
Then you might be guilty of over-ambition. You probably used too much baking powder.
See, that sounds counterintuitive to me. More baking powder should mean more rise, shouldn't it?
It means a faster rise. But if you have too much gas being produced way too quickly, the bubbles get massive.
Oh, I see.
They expand beyond what that delicate low-gluten network can hold. They get too big, they pop, the gas escapes, and there is no structure left to hold the roof up. It rises fast and crashes hard.
So you need a controlled rise, not an explosion.
Exactly.
Let's pivot to cookies for a second. This is an ongoing debate in my house. I prefer my cookies chewy, but my partner likes them crunchy. Can I control that scientifically without finding a totally different recipe?
Easily.
Yeah.
It's all about managing moisture evaporation over time. A crunchy cookie is quite literally just a dry cookie.
So a longer time in the oven.
Longer time at a slightly lower temperature allows more water to evaporate slowly, which cements the sugar structure into a crunch.
And for chewy,
You bake for less time, or sometimes at a slightly higher temperature, to set the outside edges quickly while keeping the center moist and underbaked. It's pure water management.
I love that. Now here is a pro tip from the notes that really blew my mind. It's about decoration. The crumb coat technique. I always see this on those fancy baking shows, but what is the actual physics purpose here?
This is how professionals get that glass-smooth finish on a cake. If you've ever tried to frost a bare cake directly, you know the struggle.
It's a nightmare. The spatula pulls up little bits of cake, the crumbs, and they get mixed into your pristine white icing.
It looks messy, like gravel.
Yes.
So the crumb coat is a sacrificial layer. You apply a very thin, almost translucent layer of frosting all over the bare cake. Its only job is to trap those loose crumbs. You lock them down. And then, crucially, you put the cake in the fridge to chill.
So you let that draft layer completely harden.
Yes. Once the fat in that frosting sets, you have a perfectly smooth, hard, crumb-free surface. Then you apply your thick final layer of frosting on top of that.
No crumbs, no mess.
It's a primer. You wouldn't paint a drywall without primer, so you shouldn't frost the cake without a crumb coat.
That makes perfect sense. One last technical thing before I get to the kitchen environment. Pastry. The source documents are screaming in all caps, "Keep it cold!"
Why is temperature so critical for pastry dough specifically?
This brings us back to how we create layers. Flaky pastry relies on solid chunks of fat, usually butter, sandwiched physically between layers of dough.
When that rock-cold butter hits the screaming hot oven, the water inside the butter rapidly turns to steam. That steam pushes the dough layers apart. That steam engine is what creates the flake.
But if your kitchen is hot, or if you handle the dough too much with your warm hands,
The butter melts before it ever hits the oven.
and if it melts early,
The liquid fat just soaks into the surrounding flour. You don't get defined layers. You just get a greasy, dense, tough dough. You have lost the steam engine.
so you have to keep the fat completely solid until the very last second. Baking really is just managing phase changes, solid to liquid to gas.
That's it. That is the whole game.
All right, let's wrap up with the environment. Professionalism and safety. Because apparently the kitchen is a very dangerous place if you aren't paying attention. The first rule here seems obvious, but the notes call it the wet mitt danger.
This is a huge one, and it catches people off guard. It's counterintuitive because our brains are wired to think water puts out fire. Water equals safe. But in terms of heat transfer, water is an absolute enemy.
So if I spill some water on my oven mitt or use a damp towel, I shouldn't grab a hot pan with it.
Absolutely not. Throw it in the wash immediately and get a dry one. Water conducts heat incredibly fast, way faster than dry fabric.
So the heat jumps the gap.
Right. If you grab a 400-degree baking sheet with a wet mitt, the heat travels through the water instantly, turns that water to steam, and you get a severe steam burn directly on your hand.
And the source says steam burns are worse than dry burns.
Much worse. They penetrate deeper into the skin, and they happen almost instantly. It basically feels like you aren't wearing a mitt at all. Always use perfectly dry cloths.
Good to know. What about pan discipline?
This is about leverage and spatial awareness. Always turn your pan handles inward toward the counter or the stove.
Because if a handle is sticking out over the edge,
You are one hip check away from sending boiling sugar, hot oil, or a heavy pan flying across the kitchen. It's such a simple, easy habit, but it prevents absolute catastrophe.
same goes for footwear, right? The notes specify non-slip shoes.
Yes. Kitchen floors get dusty with flour or slick with drop butter. You need grip to stay safe.
And hygiene protocols, clean as you go.
It's not just about being tidy. It's about preventing cross-contamination. You wipe down your station immediately so raw egg doesn't end up on the bottom of your cooling rack.
You also have to separate raw and cooked foods during storage.
Exactly. Standard food safety.
Speaking of the cooling rack, that brings us to the tools of precision. The notes highlight two non-negotiables: scales and cooling racks. We touched on sifting and density earlier, but why is the digital scale so vital? Can't I just use measuring cups?
You can, if you don't mind totally inconsistent results. We talk about how density varies. A cup of flour can weigh 120 grams, or it can weigh 150 grams, depending on how hard you packed it into the cup.
That's a huge difference in chemistry. It's like blindly adding 30% more cement to a concrete mixer and hoping a building stays up.
Exactly. But 120 grams is always 120 grams. Gravity doesn't lie. A digital scale completely removes the variable of human error. If you want to bake like a pro, stop measuring volume and start measuring mass.
And the cooling rack. I usually just take the cookies out and leave them on the hot metal tray on the stove.
And that is why your cookies have soggy bottoms.
Hey, no need to get personal.
It's just physics.
Yeah.
If you leave them on the heavy tray, the residual heat in the metal keeps cooking them from the bottom up. Plus, the steam escaping from the hot cookie gets trapped against the flat pan.
So the steam condenses back into water.
Right, creating a soggy layer. A wire cooling rack allows air to circulate under the bake. You need that airflow underneath to stop the cooking process and keep the bottom texture crisp.
So bringing this all together, we have gone from fungal biology to the thermodynamics of steam burns. What is the ultimate takeaway for the listener?
It means that you can stop crossing your fingers when you put a cake in the oven. You can actually control the outcome. If you understand that you are managing yeast activity with temperature, you're managing gluten structure with agitation, and you're harvesting air with the Kriening method, you aren't guessing anymore. You are engineering.
It totally changes the way I look at a recipe. It's not just a list of arbitrary chores anymore. It's a specific protocol for a chemical reaction.
Exactly. And my advice to you listening is to bring that curiosity into your kitchen. Don't just blindly follow this step. Ask why. Why does this pastry need to be cold? Why am I folding these egg whites instead of whisking them?
Because once you answer the why, you stop being just a recipe follower and you start being an actual baker.
Exactly.
I love that. And I want to leave you all with one final provocative thought today, something that really stuck with me about the crumb coat technique we talked about.
The primer layer for the frosting.
Yeah. Professional bakers know that the first layer is going to be messy. They expect it to be imperfect and full of crumbs. They deliberately put down a draft layer just to catch all the mistakes so the final result looks perfect.
Right.
And I'm sitting here thinking, where else in life or work do we need a crumb coat? Maybe we put too much pressure on ourselves to make the very first attempt at something look absolutely flawless. Maybe we all need to allow ourselves a messy first layer to catch the crumbs before we try to make things look beautiful to the outside world.
That is a surprisingly profound life lesson to pull from a tub of cake frosting.
Hey, the kitchen teaches us everything. That is all for today's deep dive. Thanks for listening and happy baking.
Stay curious, everyone.